الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم أما بعد. Chapter number 5, Babu Da'wat al-Walidayn, chapter the supplication of parents. عن أبي هريرة رضي الله تعالى عنه يقول قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ثلاث دعوات مستجابات لهن لا شك فيهن دعوة المظلوم ودعوة المسافر ودعوة الوالد على ولده. Abū Hurayrah radiallahu ta'ala anhu narrates that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, three supplications are answered without any doubt: the supplication of the oppressed, the supplication of the traveler, and the supplication of the parent against their child. Recently in Jummah we went over three mustajabud da'wat, or three du'as that are guaranteed accepted, and inside that there were the dua of the fasting person at the time of iftar as well. So that tells us that on a few occasions the Prophet ﷺ made, so there were others that were not included in other ahadith. So this hadith mentions three individuals whose dua is very stressed. The Prophet ﷺ said their du'as are accepted, la shakka fihinna, and there's no doubt that their du'as are accepted. Okay. One common individual, which was in the other hadith as well, is the da'wat al-mazlum, that the oppressed individual who makes dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala against the oppressor, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala listens to that dua and responds to that dua. And in the other hadith it's mentioned وَلَوْ بَعْدَ حِينٍ, but it's possible that the dua is accepted but at a later stage. So that the oppressor, his dua is listened to, but it's possible that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes the answer to that call later. In that hadith it's very specific that when an oppressed makes dua, then the dua actually raises to the skies, the doors of the skies are opened, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He announces, La, most definitely I will answer your call, walau ba'dahin. It's possible after some time. Okay. In this hadith there's the mention of the traveler, and this we find in many ahadith, that the person who is traveling, their dua is accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Especially, it doesn't change, but the reason why a traveler is included is as-safaru qit'atun min al-adab, that there are lots of difficulties at the time of travel. Even in this day and age where there is more comfort in traveling, it's still not the same as being at home. When you travel, there are obvious difficulties that you have to endure. There are changes to what you're normally accustomed to. And it's why in the books of fiqh, it's mentioned through the verse of the Holy Quran that a traveler, even if they are rich at home and wealthy, if they find themselves being separated from wealth at the time of travel, they become an individual who can accept zakat. So they may have tons of money back home, but because of how travel was, and it still can be today, if you lose access to that, you no longer have that wealth. You're unable to access it. Then at the point of travel, if a person becomes so destitute that they're in need of zakat, then zakat can be given to that individual. So similarly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala acknowledges the difficulties that a traveler has to endure, and thus if a traveler makes dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answers the dua. And finally, what's pertinent to the chapter and the discussion that we're having is da'watul walidi ala waladihi, that a father's supplication against his son. And this is very interesting wording. The hadith doesn't mention a father's dua for a child. That's not to say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't listen to a parent's dua for a child, but because of the heightened level of respect and the heightened level of importance of this relationship, when the relationship is not maintained, and if someone violates that, the results are very, very disastrous. So Allah's Messenger ﷺ says that the dua that's guaranteed accepted is the supplication of the parent against the child. Because of how important that relationship is to be maintained, if someone violates that relationship, then the father supplicates against the child, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says that that dua is accepted immediately. It's guaranteed accepted. And so a couple things here. Number one, parents need to be very particular and cautious that when they are upset with their child or children, that they don't say something that they don't really intend. That they don't make du'as against their children because of their anger at that moment, which can become the cause of misery for that child later on. And parents have a responsibility that when they are angry, that they don't cross lines that affects the actual, at the end of the day, if that dua is accepted, because Allah is saying that if a parent makes a dua against the child, then Allah accepts it, then the person that's going to suffer is your own child. The eventuality is that the suffering is of the child. And Imam Bukhari rahmatullahi alayhi relates in his book Al-Adab al-Mufrad a very beautiful hadith to illustrate this. And it's known as the story of Jurayj. And the account is, possibly inshallah what we'll do is we'll look at the hadith tomorrow, but it tells us of an account of an individual who was extremely, extremely pious. Extremely pious. And he was considered the monk and the most responsible to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of his time. So he wasn't the prophet, but an abid, a worshipper. And he used to live in his monastery and worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's pretty much it. And again, we'll go over the hadith tomorrow. There was an occasion when his mother came to visit him, and he was engaged in worship. So understand the context of the hadith. This person is engaged in worship, and his mother comes to see him, and she calls on to him. And Jurayj says, Ummi am as-salah, that do I turn to my mother or do I continue with my salah? Do I, what do I need to do here? Should I break my prayer and go to my mother, or should I make my mother wait until I finish my prayer? And so he continues, and she calls a second time, and the same thought crosses his mind, that Ummi am as-salah. And on the third instances, she supplicates against him. So this is not when a child frustrates the parent for disobedience. This is, he's engaged in worship. And he makes a judgment that I'm not going to break my worship, I'm going to carry on my worship to Allah, and this frustrates the mother. And she supplicates against Jurayj. And the eventuality is that that supplication comes back to bite Jurayj. And the Prophet ﷺ illustrates this in hadith. Inshallah, we'll go over it tomorrow. But it does tell us that parents need to be cautious, extremely cautious. That you don't want to say something in your frustration that ends up hurting your own child. Because parents, ultimately, they don't want bad for their children. It's just they become frustrated. And what this hadith is teaching us, that don't let that frustration make you say something that affects them. So you need to be careful with that. So what is the account of Jurayj, and what does the hadith teach us? Inshallah, we'll go over that tomorrow. But what we do learn is that these supplications are accepted by Allah. And I hinted to the subtlety at the beginning, is why is it that a parent's supplication against the child is accepted? Is because that relationship is so sacred in Allah. That relationship of child and parent is so important that if you violate it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't tolerate that. And then if the father or if the mother makes dua against the child, Allah accepts it. Allah accepts it. So one thing that we've been looking at is the parent should be careful. The flip side, a child should be careful that they don't cause the parent to become so angry that they make dua against him. A child needs to remember that. And when I say child here, and possibly I should have started off with this right at the beginning we began, and I may have hinted to it. When I say child, I mean anybody who has a parent. It doesn't matter whether you're 50 years old or 15 years old. You're still a child. And this dua of the parent against the child, that is not restricted to when a child is a teenager or when a child is very young. It could be when the child is 40, 50, 60, but you anger your parent, and your parent makes a dua against you. So you need to be very, very careful. And generally, this happens when the child is actually older. Generally, it happens when a person is 40 years old, 30 years old, 50 years old, and I'm not dependent on my parent anymore. In fact, at times the parent is dependent on me. And because of that flip of dependency, there's almost a lack of respect that's shown to the parents. That, I'm taking care of you, sort of attitude. And in that, there's lots of frustration that the parent feels. And if you're not careful, it's in that period generally where the parent, in their frustration, lets out things from their tongue and says things because of how frustrated they are with how they're being treated by their child. That's devastating for the child. Devastating. And again, I'm going on here. It is when we get older that we forget how we were dependent on our parents. That when we come to a point that in our lives where that dependency is not on them anymore, we forget. We tend to forget. And there's a fictitious, I don't know the accuracy of it, but it's the moral behind the story is great. And I've mentioned it before. Allahu Alam if it's true or not, and it's not a hadith, so I'm not relating something from the Prophet ﷺ. It's just a story that a father accompanies his son. The father's elderly. He's going through elderly age, and he's becoming senile. He's forgetting things, and he's sitting with his son in the park. And the child, old now, he's got his own children. He's busy doing his thing, and the father's just looking around, elderly in the park, and he sees a crow. And so he asks his son that, what is that? And so the son thinks to himself, my father's forgotten what it is. And he said, it's a crow, black crow. So he says, okay. A few minutes later, he sees this crow a second time. And he says, what is that? And so the son sort of thinks to himself, I just told you. But he doesn't say anything. He said, yeah, it's a black crow. And he says it a third time, and the son gets frustrated. And he loses his sort of cool. And he says, I just told you twice already. It's a crow. And you keep asking me. And so the father doesn't say anything. Doesn't respond then. And they carry on as what they were doing, and then they end up going home. And then he tells his son that I have a journal upstairs, a diary. I used to keep things and write things down in. Go and bring that for me. So the son goes upstairs, thinks, okay, my dad has maybe it's some inheritance I'm going to get. He's reminding me about. He brings it downstairs, and the father says, okay, open, go to this page, and now read this passage. Read this account of what happened. And it's the flip side. It's the same incident, but turned around. And the father is saying that today, and he's got the date down, he's got everything noted, that I took my son to the park. And as we were sitting in the park, my son is playing, and then he sees a crow. And he asks me, what is this? Because he's intrigued, he's interested. And children, sometimes they ask questions, but they're not paying attention to what they ask. So I told him it was a crow. And then he went, he started playing, he came back, and he saw it a second time. Sometimes the children know, and they just do this anyways. And he said to me again, what is this? Second time. So I said, a crow. And he said, he went and started playing, and then he came back a third time, and he said, what is this? And I said, it's a crow. He said he did this to me 10 or 12 times, and I answered with love, the same as I did the first time. Because he's my child. And this is what tends to happen when people grow old. That when a child becomes elderly, they forget their dependency that they had on their parents. And when a parent is now in a situation where they're dependent on them, easily frustrated with them. But that same parent didn't become frustrated with you. And so it's at that age. So that's what I was hinting towards, that sometimes it is the younger children that incur the evil, incur the dua of their parents, but it's also, and a lot of times it is, when an adult who has a parent who's older forgets that is my parent still. That is still my father, that is still my mother. And just because I am now a big shot, I'm earning more money than, and children take it's like it's like pride on that, that I'm earning more than my dad, I have a better house than my dad. Subhanallah. And we forget the struggles that that they endured for you. And in that arrogance, it's almost as if a disdain for them and treating them in the wrong way. The harrowing accounts that I have to endure inside the office when people come to me. So the stories that I have to hear of how adult children are treating their parents, it makes you, at times you think to yourself, it's better not to have children. That's how bad it gets. It's unimaginable what type of how the relationship breaks down to such an extent, and how there's a lack of respect for the parent just because you've become old yourself. That subhanallah, it's you listen to the stories and you actually think to yourself, this person would have been better off if he didn't have a child, for them to be enduring this in their elderly age. And one person came to me and he said to me, Sheikh, how do I exclude my child from my inheritance? I want them to have nothing. And I just sat there for a few minutes. I said, something has to have happened, like serious. For a parent, you don't just come and say that and make that judgment that I don't want my child to have anything from me. So I said, look, uncle, if you don't mind me asking, tell me why. Why are you so upset that you've come to this decision that you don't want your child to have anything for you? Probably, as you were working, that's who you worked for. So what's changed today? And he said, what can I tell you, Sheikh? That my son, who I nurtured, who I educated, who I spent my time and my wealth upon, he is beating me up today. He is abusing me today. And not verbally, physically. To the point that I'm scared to go into my own house. So I said, how can I leave anything for this child of mine? This is like I said, the account and stories are harrowing, because we forget that responsibility of being a child to the parent, it's not limited to age. It's not just when you're 15 years old or 20 years old. It's lifetime. It's lifelong. Even your responsibility, there's a chapter. Your responsibility to your parents still remains after they pass away. Not only when they're alive, after they pass away as well. Khair, we've gone on a bit long today. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant me the understanding, all of you the understanding. We'll carry on with this tomorrow. Subhanallah bihamdi, subhanakallah bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Jazakumullah khair.